All right, deep divers, welcome back to another deep dive with yours truly. This is episode 12, and we're tackling a pretty big one today. I mean, literally big SeaWorld.
Big in so many ways.
Yeah, and I think we're all familiar with those iconic Shamu shows and the killer whales splashing everyone in the audience, but things have gotten a bit more complicated since then, haven't they?
Definitely more complicated, especially since Blackfish came out and really shifted public perception about SeaWorld and its treatment of these amazing animals.
Yeah, Blackfish really made a splash, pun intended.
It did indeed.
And it left a lot of people questioning, is SeaWorld this happy-go-lucky place where whales and dolphins frolic freely, or is there something darker going on behind the scenes?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is, and luckily for us, you've been diving deep into a whole treasure trove of sources, articles, research, even some leaked SeaWorld memos that hint at 15 things SeaWorld might not want us to know.
I did some digging, and what I found was pretty fascinating.
Fascinating and maybe a little disturbing, right?
You could say that...
Okay, well, let's jump right in and see what these 15 secrets are, shall we? First up, the dorsal fin collapse. You know those majestic fins on male orcas that can reach up to like 6 feet tall?
Right, the ones that make them look so impressive.
Exactly. Imagine that, but flopped over to the side like a sad, soggy noodle.
It's not a pretty sight, and it's a big point of contention. SeaWorld claims it happens naturally in the wild, but...
But that's not the whole truth, is it?
Not quite. Studies have shown that dorsal fin collapse is incredibly rare in healthy wild orcas. Those fins are made of collagen and need the pressure of constant swimming and diving to stay upright.
Ah, so it's like a giant underwater sail that needs wind to stay full.
Exactly. And in the confined space of a tank with altered swimming patterns, those orcas, especially the males, aren't getting the pressure they need to maintain those fins.
So SeaWorld is basically giving these majestic creatures floppy fin syndrome.
In a way, yes. And the kicker is when orcas with collapsed fins are returned to the wild, their fins often perk right back up.
Really? So that kind of debunks SeaWorld's whole "it's a natural thing" argument.
Yeah. It does suggest that captivity plays a significant role.
Okay, SeaWorld, point one for the skeptics. Now let's move on to another touchy subject, breeding practices. Baby orcas, tiny shamu, splashing around learning to do backflips.
It's not as cute and cuddly behind the scenes, I'm afraid. Since capturing wild orcas was banned in the U.S. back in 1972, SeaWorld has turned to artificial insemination.
Artificial insemination? That sounds a bit like something out of a sci-fi movie.
It's definitely not the natural way things happen. It involves manually collecting semen from male orcas and then artificially inseminating the females.
Okay, not exactly the birds and the bees story I was expecting. But hey, at least they're not kidnapping orcas from their families anymore, right?
That's true, but there are still concerns about the ethics of this practice. For example, SeaWorld has been accused of inseminating females at a much younger age than they would naturally breed in the wild.
Too young. Like, isn't there some kind of orca age of consent?
Well, we're talking about whales, not humans. But the point is, this practice has been linked to a higher rate of stillbirths among captive orcas. And even when calves are born healthy,
they get taken away from their moms.
It's not always immediate, but separation is common. And here's where it gets really interesting. Orcas are highly intelligent and social creatures with complex emotional lives.
Yeah, I've heard they're like the Einsteins of the ocean.
In fact, they're one of the few species with more advanced brain structures than humans in the areas that control empathy and emotional response.
Wait, are you saying orcas are more emotionally evolved than us? I mean, I cry at dog food commercials, but...
It's true. And separating a mother and calf can cause significant distress and even long-term psychological effects.
So even though SeaWorld is technically making baby orcas, they're not exactly giving them the best start in life. Point two for the skeptics.
It's definitely a complex issue with valid arguments on both sides.
Right. But speaking of capturing orcas, you mentioned that's a no-no in the U.S. now. But what about other places? Are they still snatching up whales from the wild?
It's a good question. While they can't legally capture orcas in U.S. waters, there have been reports of capture efforts continuing in countries with less strict regulations.
So they're basically outsourcing their whale napping. Sneaky. But let's rewind for a second. You mentioned a chilling story about a capture in Puget Sound back in 1970. I love a good backstory.
Well, imagine this: boats and airplanes herding a pod of orcas into a narrow cove, all in an attempt to capture calves from marine parks, including SeaWorld.
Airplanes. They were seriously using air power to catch whales.
It's true. And what's even more fascinating is the orcas' response. They actually tried to outsmart their captors using their intelligence and complex communication to protect their young. The males would act as decoys, while the females and calves tried to slip away unnoticed.
So it's like an underwater black and white version of Ocean's 11.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
It highlights not only their intelligence, but also their strong family bonds and the lengths they'll go to protect each other.
Man, I'm starting to feel like I'm rooting for the wrong team here.
But
But sadly, in this case, human technology won out.
yes, unfortunately. It's a reminder of the power imbalance at play in these situations.
Okay, so we've got floppy fins, questionable baby-making practices, and international whale heists. But what about the orcas' day-to-day life at SeaWorld? I mean, they always look pretty well fed in the shows, right?
That's where things get a little more complicated. Let's start with the diet. And the wild orcas have a diverse diet. They feast on fish, penguins, seals, sea lions, even other whales.
Wow, talk about a surf and turf buffet.
Mm-hmm.
So what's on the menu at SeaWorld microwaved fish sticks?
While SeaWorld does provide fish, it's often frozen and not as varied as what they'd find in their natural habitat.
Okay, not exactly gourmet dining. But hey, maybe they have like a killer whale version of DoorDash.
I'm afraid not. And here's where it gets even more controversial. SeaWorld has admitted to using a cocktail of drugs to manage the orca's behavior. We're talking benzodiazepines, antipsychotics, even contraceptives.
Wait, whoa. Are you telling me they're giving these highly intelligent creatures antipsychotics? Like the kind humans take for serious mental health conditions?
It's true. And while these medications can be helpful in certain situations, they're typically used sparingly in humans due to the potential for side effects and dependence.
I'm no marine biologist, but that doesn't sound good. Makes you wonder if those dazzling jumps and flips are more about chemical manipulation than genuine training.
It's a valid concern, and it raises questions about the ethics of altering these animals' natural behaviors for entertainment purposes.
Okay, so SeaWorld's version of Free Willy might be more like Drug Willy 0.3 for the skeptics.
I think it's important to remember that there are always multiple perspectives on these issues.
Of course. But let's be real. Anyone who's seen One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest knows you don't mess around with antipsychotics.
It's certainly a topic that warrants further investigation and discussion.
Agreed. But for now, I'm officially side-eyeing those happy shampoo commercials. So what else have you got for me? Spill the tea.
Well, next up, we should delve into the qualifications of SeaWorld trainers and address some of the safety concerns that have been raised.
Ooh, trainer talk. I always thought those guys were like super smart marine biologists whispering sweet nothings to the whales and fluent orcas.
It's a common misconception. While some may have a background in marine science, many are primarily performers who have undergone extensive training in animal handling and showmanship.
Wait, so they're not all like Dr. Dolittle chatting with the creatures?
Not exactly. And that brings us to the question of safety. Even the most experienced trainers can't always predict how an orca will react in a given situation.
Right, orcas are wild animals with unpredictable instincts even after years of training.
Exactly. And working with such large and powerful creatures inherently involves risks. Even John Hargrove, one of SeaWorld's most experienced trainers, eventually became an outspoken critic of the park, advocating for orcas to be kept in their natural environment.
Whoa, so even a SeaWorld veteran turned against the tide. That's got to say something.
It does highlight the complex ethical dilemmas surrounding captive orcas.
Okay, so maybe those creener smiles aren't always as genuine as they appear. And maybe those safety protocols aren't as foolproof as SeaWorld would like us to believe.
It's certainly worth considering these concerns as we delve deeper into the inner workings of SeaWorld.
Agreed. So what else is lurking beneath the surface of those sparkling blue pools?
Well, those sparkling blue pools, they require a lot more than just chlorine to stay clean.
Ah, so it's not just good old-fashioned elbow grease. What else are they using?
They use a whole cocktail of chemicals to keep those pools sparkling, some of which can be pretty harsh.
Okay, so we're talking industrial-strength cleaning products. Not exactly what I'd want to be swimming in.
Right, and the animals are exposed to these chemicals on a daily basis. There's been a high incidence of blindness in sea lions and walruses at SeaWorld, potentially linked to chemical exposure.
Blindness, that's awful.
Yeah.
And what about the trainers? Are they at risk too?
Trainers have reported skin conditions and even eye burns from the high levels of chlorine used in the pools.
Eye burns. Ouch. I bet that stings. Literally. I can't imagine those chemicals are doing wonders for the orca's sensitive skin either.
You're right. Orcas have highly sensitive skin, and prolonged exposure to these chemicals could have long-term health consequences.
So it's not just the orca's mental well-being we should be worried about, but their physical health too. Okay, SeaWorld, you're officially on my watch list. What else is hiding behind those choreographed splashes?
Let's talk about those performances, the ones that made SeaWorld famous. There have been over 200 reported incidents of trainer injuries caused by orcas.
200. That's a lot more than just a few accidental bumps and nudges.
Right.
We're talking about some serious aggression here.
Yes, some incidents were minor, but others resulted in severe injuries, and tragically, there have even been fatalities.
Fatalities?
Mm.
You're talking about Dawn Brancheau, right? The trainer who was killed by Tillicum?
Yeah.
It was a horrifying incident that really shook people up.
It was a tragedy that brought the dangers of orca captivity into sharp focus. But it's important to note that aggression isn't the only concerning behavior observed in captive orcas.
So what else have they been up to? Are they like writing bad reviews on Yelp?
Not quite. Researchers and former trainers have documented instances of self-harm, with orcas gnawing on concrete and gates causing injuries to themselves.
Self-harm. That's heartbreaking. Why would they do that?
It's likely a sign of stress and frustration. They've also observed orcas displaying signs of listlessness, just floating aimlessly in their tanks. It's a far cry from their active and engaged behavior in the wild.
It's like they've lost their spark. And given everything we've learned so far, it's hard not to feel a pang of sympathy for these creatures.
It does make you wonder about the psychological toll of captivity.
And you mentioned that captive orcas have shorter lifespans than their wild counterparts. Is that just from the stress?
Stress is definitely a factor. But there are likely multiple culprits at play: limited space for exercise, potential exposure to pathogens, and the unnatural diet. While orcas in the wild can live for 50 to 80 years, captive orcas typically live only 30 to 40 years.
Wow, that's a huge difference. It's like they're being robbed of decades of life. It's starting to feel less like Blackfish and more like Black Mirror in here.
It's a sobering thought, and it raises important questions about the ethics of keeping these animals confined for our entertainment.
Speaking of entertainment, let's dish about those famous SeaWorld shows. I mean, who doesn't love a good orca backflip? But those tricks can't be easy to teach, right? What's the training really like?
Well, like many animal training programs, SeaWorld uses food rewards to incentivize desired behaviors. But there have also been allegations of food deprivation being used as punishment when orcas don't comply.
Food deprivation. You mean like, no dinner for you, Shamu, you didn't splash high enough?
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
And it's a practice that raises serious ethical concerns.
It's certainly not the positive reinforcement technique I was picturing, more like performer-starve vibes.
Yikes. Exactly. And beyond food deprivation, there are concerns about the types of behaviors the orcas are trained to perform. Some tricks involve launching themselves onto platforms, which can be incredibly jarring and potentially painful for such a large animal.
Ouch. Yeah, my knees hurt just thinking about it. It's easy to get caught up in the spectacle of it all and forget that these are wild animals being forced to perform unnatural behaviors.
It's a crucial point, and it challenges us to consider whether these performances truly benefit the animals or merely serve as entertainment.
Okay, so we've got food deprivation, potentially painful stunts, and shorter lifespans. Anything else we need to add to this SeaWorld Don't Try This at Home list?
Let's talk about workloads. Unlike humans, orcas at SeaWorld don't have labor laws or unions to protect them from overwork. Take Kasatka, for example. She was forced to perform 8 shows a day for 40 years.
8 shows a day for 40 years. That's like the orca version of working a double shift at a call center forever. No wonder she wasn't feeling too peppy in those later years.
It's a grueling schedule, and to make matters worse, the only breaks she received were for breeding, after which her calves were immediately taken from her and she was sent right back to work.
They separated her from her babies and then expected her to just perform. That's heartbreaking.
It's hard to imagine the emotional toll that must have taken on her. And it's not surprising that Kasatka, along with other overworked orcas, developed lung disease and died prematurely.
Okay, I'm officially starting to think those SeaWorld trainers aren't just whispering sweet nothings to the whales. They're probably whispering, "Get back to work, you overpaid, oversized goldfish."
It's certainly a different perspective than what's often portrayed in SeaWorld's marketing.
Right. Speaking of things not being what they seem, you mentioned that keeping cold water creatures like orcas in sunny locations like Orlando is, well, not ideal. I mean, orcas are black and white, not tan lines and beach umbrellas.
Exactly. They generally prefer cooler waters, and the shallow tanks at SeaWorld's parks offer little respite from the intense sun. They don't have much deep water or shade to escape to.
So they're basically getting sunburned. Poor things. I bet they'd kill for a little SPF 50.
Yes, sunburn is a common problem for captive orcas, and to conceal it from the public, SeaWorld has been accused of using black zinc oxide makeup to cover up the burns.
They're putting makeup on the whales. Now that's just adding insult to injury? It's like they're trying to cover up a crime scene with a little concealer?
It certainly raises questions about transparency and SeaWorld's commitment to animal welfare.
Okay, I'm officially swapping my SeaWorld souvenir hat for a tinfoil one. What other conspiracies are you hiding in your research files?
Well, perhaps we should shift our focus to SeaWorld's treatment of other animals. Remember that USDA investigation we discussed earlier?
The one where they found expired surgical instruments? Like something out of a horror movie?
Yes. Well, it wasn't just focused on dolphins. It also revealed questionable practices involving penguins.
Penguins. Those cute little tuxedo-wearing birds. What did they do? Forget to pay their parking tickets?
Nothing quite so dramatic, but one incident involved shipping 20 penguins across the country in a cramped crate via FedEx.
FedEx. Like the company that delivers my online shopping. Those penguins had to endure the same fate as my last pair of shoes.
Unfortunately, yes. These penguins were forced to stand in the same position for 13 hours with limited ventilation and only a block of ice for cooling.
13 hours. That's longer than some of my flights. And without even a tiny bag of peanuts. Poor little guys.
It's definitely not the most humane way to transport animals.
No kidding. It sounds like a recipe for disaster. Or at least some very grumpy penguins.
It certainly raises concerns about SeaWorld's handling of animal transportation.
Okay, so they're drugging the whales, burning them with chlorine and sunshine, making them work overtime, and shipping penguins like overnight packages. What's next? Are they forcing the dolphins to do their taxes?
While we haven't uncovered any evidence of tax-related dolphin labor, there are concerns about the orca's dental health that we should discuss.
Yes, those pearly whites. I bet all that gnawing on concrete doesn't do wonders for their dental hygiene.
You're right. All that gnawing, likely out of frustration and boredom, takes a toll on their teeth. Studies have shown that captive orcas have a much higher incidence of dental problems compared to their wild counterparts.
So what kind of dental drama are we talking about? Are they rocking dentures, braces?
More like chipped teeth, extreme wear, and infections. Over half of the captive orcas studied had undergone some form of dental surgery, which involves drilling into their teeth to remove infected pulp.
Drilling? Ugh, I hate going to the dentist myself.
Yeah.
I can't imagine what that must be like for a massive orca. Do they at least get a little nitrous oxide to chill out?
I'm afraid not. And to prevent further infections, they have to flush the drilled teeth daily with chemicals which can further weaken the teeth.
So it's like a never-ending cycle of dental distress.
It's a serious concern. And some experts believe that chronic infections potentially stemming from these dental problems might have played a role in the deaths of some captive orcas.
Okay, this deep dive is getting darker by the minute. But I have to ask, what about Tilikum, the orca who killed Dawn Brancheau? We've talked about aggression and stress, but was there more to that tragic story?
It's important to remember that this incident occurred during a feeding show, a time when captive orcas are often at their most stressed and agitated.
So you're saying his actions might have been a reflection of his frustration with captivity?
Yeah.
Like he just snapped?
It's a possibility that can't be ignored. While SeaWorld maintained that it was a tragic accident, others argue that his behavior was a desperate attempt to communicate his distress.
Man, that's heavy. It's like the whole killer whale label took on a whole new meaning that day. Okay, so we've established that captivity has a lot of downsides for these creatures, but what's the alternative? We can't just airlift all these orcas back to the ocean, can we?
You're right. Simply releasing them into the wild wouldn't be feasible. Many wouldn't survive having lost the skills they need to hunt and navigate. But there are other options like sea sanctuaries.
Sea sanctuaries? What are those, like orca retirement homes? Do they get tiny orca bathrobes and shuffleboard tournaments?
They're more like large, enclosed areas of the ocean where captive orcas can live in a more natural environment while still receiving care and protection. They would have more space to roam, opportunities to engage in more natural behaviors, and a chance to live with less stress.
So like a halfway house for rehabilitating whales?
It's a good analogy.
Yeah.
And it's an idea that's gaining traction as more people become aware of the ethical concerns surrounding orca captivity.
Well, I'm sold sea sanctuaries for the win. But you mentioned earlier that SeaWorld isn't the only organization keeping orcas in captivity. What about those other places? Are they any better?
Unfortunately, many face similar criticisms regarding tank-sized training methods and animal welfare. One particularly heartbreaking case is that of Lolita, an orca who has lived alone in a small tank at the Miami Aquarium for over 40 years.
Alone? For 40 years? That's like solitary confinement for a whale. That's just cruel.
It's a tragic situation. Lolita was captured from the wild as a calf and has spent her entire life in this tiny, inadequate enclosure. Her story has sparked international outrage and calls for her release to a sea sanctuary.
So what's the holdup? Why is she still there?
There are complex legal and financial issues involved. Lolita is a major attraction for the Miami Aquarium, and they've resisted calls to release her, claiming she's too old and wouldn't survive in the wild.
It's like they're holding her hostage for profit. Okay. I'm officially adding Free Lolita to my to-do list.
It's a worthy cause.
This whole deep dive has been an emotional roller coaster. I started out thinking Shamu yay, and now I'm like, SeaWorld nay.
It's a lot to process, but understanding the complexities of this issue is crucial if we want to advocate for positive change.
Oh, good deep breaths. I'm ready to emerge from the sea of information and figure out what we do with all this newfound knowledge. Where do we go from here?
It's been quite the deep dive, hasn't it?
It really has. I mean, I started this whole thing thinking Shamu yay, and now I'm like, Shamu, maybe not so much.
It's understandable to feel conflicted. The more you learn about the realities of orca captivity, the harder it is to reconcile with the entertainment aspect.
Yeah, it's kind of like finding out your favorite childhood candy is made with, like, crushed beetle shells. Suddenly it's not so appealing.
That's certainly one way to put it, but I think the key takeaway here is the importance of informed decision-making. We can't just blindly accept what we see and hear, especially when it comes to animal welfare.
Right. We need to dig deeper, ask questions, and, not be afraid to challenge the status quo.
Yeah, exactly. It's like that old saying, don't believe everything you read on the internet. But in this case, it's more like, don't believe everything you see at a marine park.
So informed decision-making, check. But what about action? What can we actually do to make a difference for these animals?
There are a lot of ways to get involved. You can support organizations that advocate for marine mammal welfare. You can push for stricter regulations on marine parks, and you can consider supporting sea sanctuaries as an alternative to traditional marine parks.
Sea sanctuaries? Those sound promising. Give these creatures a chance to live a more natural and, dignified life.
Absolutely. It's about shifting our focus from entertainment to conservation, recognizing that these animals deserve our respect and protection, not just our amusement.
Well said. So my fellow deep divers, as we surface from this SeaWorld expose, we leave you with this challenge. What will you do with this newfound knowledge?
Will you continue to support businesses that prioritize profit over animal welfare, or will you become a voice for change?
The choice is yours, but choose wisely. Remember, every splash has a ripple effect. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us, and we'll see you next time for another plunge into the fascinating depths of knowledge.